A glass to the past, and the ladies cross the ages, fallen fathers from the motherland whose lives are on the pages. And the bard who said it best when he told us all the world's a stage. So fellas, grab a glass and lift your spirits to the seventh age.
Welcome, one and all, to the Seven Ages Audio Journal. It's time once again to pour up a glass and pull up a chair as we gather together here in our favorite corner of the Crosstime Pub, looking far and wide for evidence of our ancient past from coast to coast and to the northernmost climes of the great river of the upward sun. Joining me, as always, our geologist in residence, Mr. James Waldo of Arkansas. How are you, sir?
I'm doing well. How are you doing, Micah?
I'm really good. And you and I, for the first time on this show, are flying solo. We have some good news, actually. Jason is not with us today because he is officially back on daddy duty, having welcomed the latest member of the Pentrail clan into the world, and he is a bouncing baby boy. We are very happy for the Pentrail family, and so he gave us his blessing and said, you guys will have to soldier on without me on this one. I couldn't imagine a better reason to do so. So congratulations to Jason, Crystal, and the family.
Yeah, congratulations, you guys. That's a big deal, and we're super happy for everybody.
That's right. James, you've been there once or twice.
A couple of times, maybe.
Yeah.
We're still in the middle of the move from Savannah to Arkansas, living hotel life right now. So we should be, by Thanksgiving, we should be in a house and kind of getting settled down. But right now is a transition, I guess you could call it.
Yeah, well, the Seven Ages team, we are expanding our territory. You're headed west. It's like the gold rush all over again. I'm still holding down the fort up here in the Appalachians, though, my man. I seem to be the only guy who isn't on the move or doesn't have incredibly massive life changes underway.
Sometimes that's an envious position to be in. I'm not going to lie.
Yeah, you've been a road warrior lately. Well,
I tell you.
Yeah, although I enjoy that. And you and I have been talking about 2020, actually, and some trips I might try and make out there to the Ozarks, come visit you guys and everything, see the new house, and, continue what we love to do, exploration of history and archaeology in that region of the world, too. We've kind of been concentrated on the Southeast for the last few years, really since the inception of this podcast and our research efforts together. So it'll be nice to get out there and kind of, bring what we do a little further west. Eventually, maybe we'll make it to the West Coast, huh?
Yeah, that'd be neat. The good thing about the United States is everywhere you go, there's great things to see, lots of interesting history, a lot of interesting contemporary things to see.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And on the subject of contemporary archaeology, although, again, we're looking at the past, there's a big update that was recently released by the Greek Ministry of Culture and Sports, and this reported by Archaeology magazine. They announced that researchers from the Ephorate of Antiquities at Euboea returned to the Antikythera shipwreck site this month. Of course, this is the location where the famous Antikythera mechanism was recovered. And I should point out to people that although that remains one of the most enigmatic and also, I think, one of the most anachronistic elements of archaeology, you find something that resembles modern machinery that was being built in ancient Greece. I mean, it is the definition of an out-of-place artifact, but it's also been established as having been from that period, and advanced though it is, and remarkable though that find is, it's just another, perspective that we are able to glean about how advanced many ancient cultures actually were. However, that wasn't the only thing that was recovered from the Antikythera shipwreck. In fact, ongoing studies there with this current return just underscore the fact that we're continuing to learn things. And there are some, maybe not quite as out of place or as enigmatic as the famous mechanism recovered there, but there are certainly some other artifacts that are being recovered that are unique to that site. And Archaeology magazine reports that known for a bronze complex clockwork mechanism recovered in 1901, the shipwreck was discovered by sponge divers in deep water off the coast of the Greek island of Antikythera in 1900. But this season, team members led by Angeliki J. Simosai recovered bones, possible olive pits, a piece of wood studded with 4 bronze nails that may have been part of the ship's structure, a bronze ring, a piece of iron, and fragments of amphoras made in Italy and on the Greek island of Kos. Now, I went over to the website of the Greek Ministry of Culture and Sports and translated the actual press release where they note the following, James. They say, initially, the wreck was re-identified and rebounded after the last survey of September 2017. They say 5 sacks of sand were left undone from previous excavation periods, the products of which were carefully screened with special care. They go on to note the bones that were recovered this time around. They say that during the separation process, and I apologize in advance because I translated this on the fly right before we started recording, they say bones were collected that need to be analyzed, possibly olive kernels, as mentioned in the archaeology article, and that bronze ring that they said was unknown prior to the present. But here are some of the other things that have been found. They say, in addition, a plastic basket filled with amphora sections, bases, necks, and bodies saved from the abdomen to the base were lifted. Among the findings was also an iron stub with a circular end. Importantly, they say a different variety was identified among the amphorae bases from the island of Kos, whose origin is not yet known and their identification is required. And for anyone who is unfamiliar with that term, what we're describing is, again, these tall ancient Greek or Roman jars that had 2 handles and a fairly narrow neck. So you've probably seen both actual representations and also representations in art from that period if you've studied ancient Greek and Roman art. They recovered a number of these, and these particular ones from the Antikythera wreck site are believed to have come from the island of Kos, but also they've been unidentified previously. So it's quite interesting. And again, the ministry there in Greece wrote that an impressive find is a piece of wood that is probably a static element of the wreck that has 4 bronze nails. All the findings were transferred to the laboratories of the Ephoret of Antiquities. So, again, that site continues to yield remarkable discoveries. I don't think it'll ever outshine the famous mechanism for which the site is best known, but again, there's just incredible stuff that continues to come from that place.
It's hard to top the mechanism, but one thing I've always wondered about that is that the only mechanism of its kind that existed in the ancient world? I mean, why haven't we seen something like this from other excavations or from collections that have been passed down through history? Why did we have to find one in a shipwreck in the Mediterranean?
Well, that's an interesting question. I guess we could infer from it a couple of things. The fact that it was on board a ship, to me, strongly indicates the possibility that it was used for navigation and that it would have been useful for a ship that might have been traversing large areas. If it were a navigational instrument or one that was aiding navigation, that might indicate that this kind of sailing vessel was capable of traveling great distances, which is rather compelling considering what we talked about on the last episode. Again, the idea of out-of-place artifacts is often met with some suspicion and skepticism, and it should be. It really should be. That's why we kind of tried to talk about that in a context last time that sort of demystified some of those discoveries. But I think that there are some legitimate discoveries where coins and things like this appear in places where you wouldn't expect to find one. And it very well may be that some of these ancient sea kings, that they were getting around it. There may have been trade networks and exploration occurring in the ancient world that far exceeded what we would expect. But the other thing I would infer from looking at the Antikythera mechanism, James, it is possible that something, with the wheels, the cogs, and with the internal structure of that device, it's certainly possible that that could be a one-off, that some brilliant visionary inventor, a Tesla type, who was able to just see in his mind incredible things and then put them into work, that he had the machining capabilities and from a structural engineering perspective was able just to envision and then build something remarkable like that. Sure, it could have been a one-off, but to look at how well that thing is designed and how well it functions, I couldn't help but think that this is evidence of some sort of a progression. And I bet you could talk from the engineering perspective on this. To me, it seems to bespeak a technology that was in successive stages of development, and I would have to think that because of that there must be similar mechanisms, maybe as yet undiscovered, maybe lost to time, but they would had to have existed.
Yeah, I agree with that. That wasn't something that somebody I don't think it would be a one-off type of a thing. It would probably be something that was refined over time by some person that, a Tesla or an Elon Musk, type of a person. And maybe, some ruler someplace had specially requested this thing be made, and it was on its way to arrive. And I never even considered that it might be a navigation device for seafaring. I'd never heard that before, but yeah, that's actually a really interesting thing to think about.
Well, I mean, if it is seemingly designed with astronomical calculations in mind, again, if it's an ancient computer that seems to have had use with studying astronomy, etc., again, one way that these ancient mariners were able to get around is that they were able to utilize a knowledge of astronomy to help them orient themselves and navigate. And so, again, the study of astronomy combined with a sailing vessel, again, I'm just kind of spitballing here, but it would seem to indicate to me that very well may have had navigational purposes. And I'm sure that there's plenty of other literature that actually goes much deeper into this. Maybe we should look at that at some point, but fundamental to the argument here, again, that shipwreck site continues to show us things about the ancient world that we haven't known previously, and it's just kind of fascinating. Something else, of course, that is fascinating to us and which we periodically give updates about on this show is the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis. And one reason that we focus on that topic a lot, I've had people write in and say, well, you guys really are interested in that, aren't you? And the reason primarily is, in addition to the fact that it is an interesting, very compelling ancient mystery, but also one that has implications with regard to the survival of the human race. Again, if an impact occurred in the ancient past, we want to try and understand as much as we can about what the effect more broadly on Earth may be. But also, we have a lot of friends who are professionals in archaeology and in geology who are looking for the evidence in support of this hypothesis. It's not a matter of, well, this is what we believe, and so we want to go out and find the evidence. It is that there is mounting evidence that seems to strongly indicate something unusual that happened around 12,800 years ago. And one man who's really led the charge with this area of science is Christopher Moore, who's a good friend of ours. And we have been, blessed enough to be able to participate in some excavations that he has been working over several consecutive seasons at the White Pond site in South Carolina. And we did an episode, of course, a few months ago, Legends of the White Pond Lodge, where we talked with Chris. And at the time that we were down there around St. Patrick's Day, James, there'd just been a study that had come out, which Chris gave the first interview about on the microphone. It was literally an exclusive to us on this podcast at that time. Chris is back in the scientific news, however, because we're very excited to hear that he has just published the results of studies there at White Pond. And as we had an inkling of an idea already, core sediment samples indicate this enigmatic platinum anomaly that is associated with the strata layer that can be dated back to the time of what we call the Younger Dryas event. And this is part of maybe the most significant evidence, in my opinion, with relation to the impact hypothesis, because again, when you find platinum in an area of geologic strata like that, this is a rare earth element, and for there to be an abundance of it in a level and widespread all around the earth like that, it seems to strongly indicate that there was a lot of platinum that was introduced into the earth's atmosphere. What was the source of that? And keep in mind that only a few weeks ago there was a new study that also indicates that this platinum anomaly has been found in Africa as well. And so it's quite fortuitous that we hear from Chris Moore. And James, you've been really looking at this paper a lot, and maybe you can, from the geological perspective, give us a little insight on this.
Yeah, sure. And I appreciate Chris. Chris takes the time to send this individually to all of us for us to read. So thanks, Chris. I do appreciate that. It took me all week to get to it, but I did have some time to sit down and kind of go through it. And I thought what would be a good idea on the show this morning, just to kind of talk about what work they're actually doing there. So, and I won't go into the history of White Pond. We've talked about that quite a bit.
Sure.
But the last two studies, I think, that Chris has been involved with, there was a 2015 study that they did in conjunction with the USGS, where they collected core samples from the lake, or from the pond rather, just to determine if the Younger Dryas lower boundary was even present in the sediment there, and it was. So they came back and they did another study with the USGS, collected more core samples in 2016 with an expanded analytical plan, basically. Mm-hmm. So, and people that aren't familiar with this type of work or any kind of sampling type environmental sampling you might do is you start out a little bit small, and then as you find things, you may expand it, and it's, you don't go all the way because you gotta save money. There's only so much money for these things.
Well, you got to determine if there's something to study first.
Correct. Right.
Yeah.
So the 2016, they went back and they wanted to determine platinum was there and several other things. So what they tested for was platinum coprophilus spores, which basically is fungus that's present in the dung of warm-blooded animals. Mm-hmm. Organic material, DNA, pyrogenic carbon, which basically is soot. It's carbon that's produced from burning. In this case, it'd be wildfires or trees and brush and that kind of thing burning.
Right.
Carbon and nitrogen stable isotopes. Magnetic susceptibility of bulk sediments. That's their language in the study. I think what that means, though, is they were looking for magnetic spherules in the in the layers there. Cryptotephra. Tephra is basically volcanic ash. And so cryptotephra, crypto meaning hidden, in this case would be tephra that you couldn't see with the naked eye. You'd have to have a microscopic analysis of that. And that would either rule in or rule out volcanic activity as part of the mechanism for this. And they didn't find any. So that's not an avenue that they're going to look at now. And then they did a full suite of geochemistry on it. Now, one thing that and I did some math on this, and this is something we hadn't talked about before. But the entire sediment core for the last 10,000 years is 210 centimeters thick, which is about 83 inches or about 7 feet thick. So that's a sedimentation rate over the last 10,000 years on average of 0.021 centimeters per year. The Younger Dryas horizon, as it's called, from the lower boundary to the upper boundary, which is just below this 10,000 years, is 10 centimeters thick. So that is about 3.93 inches, just a little less than 4 inches. That time period is about 100 years, is what they're saying the Younger Dryas horizon lasted. Mm-hmm. So that's 0.1 centimeters per year sedimentation rate, which is about 5 times the average sedimentation rate for the following 10,000 years. So obviously there was a lot of particulate and a lot of things in the atmosphere that settled out very quickly over that 100-year period. And I would suspect that it actually peaked at the very beginning at the lower boundary of the Younger Dryas and then tapered off towards the 10,000-year sedimentation average towards the end of the 100 years, if that makes sense.
It does.
As the material falls out.
Well, that's really interesting, James. I mean, actually, that's in my opinion, one of the better breakdowns I think I've heard about that. In other words, what you're saying is that there was a combination, and maybe we could talk briefly about the combination that we're discussing here, combinations of different particulates that were contributing to a greater rate of sedimentation that occurs in conjunction with the Younger Dryas. So what are we looking at? If there's evidence of biomass burnings or wildfires, are we looking at ash? Are we looking at sedimentation from ejecta? I mean, what are the sources?
Yeah, all of those things. So there would be soot from biomass burning, wildfires and that type of thing. There would be whatever was ejected into the atmosphere if there was an impact event, which we obviously think that that's what the cause was. There would be a lot of material in the atmosphere from that. And of course, all of that the maximum amount of it would occur at the time of the event and then shortly after, as the wildfires peaked and then burned themselves out over time. And then that sediment would, and those materials would slowly fall out of the atmosphere over most of it would probably fall out over the first 5 or 10 years, or maybe even sooner than that. And then over the 100 years, it would, that they've been able to identify in this horizon, it would pretty much all fall out. And then things would sort of go back to the new normal, I guess you could call it. And then things didn't really change a whole lot over the last 10,000 years. Right.
Although, again, the actual period of cold reversal that we identify as the Younger Dryas did occur and last for a fair bit longer. But again, that period of great change that is specifically related to it, again, geologically, that's really interesting. And hey, again, that's a site that we, the Seven Ages team, we have worked. We've been there personally, and Chris has been kind enough to allow us to assist with a bit of the labor and the toil of shoveling and sifting dirt there at that site. Again, primarily a site of archaeological interest, but from the perspective of geoarchaeology, which is Chris's forte, he has been doing remarkable work the last few years in terms of chemical analysis and the identification of the platinum anomaly in this particular boundary. Fascinating, of course, that he's found it right there at the White Pond site, which is one that is so significant for us, having been there. So I guess what we're going to have to do, James, is get him on the program to talk about this sometime soon. We've had him on in the past. Actually, I think he's alumni at this point. We've actually interviewed him twice formally for the show, so maybe it's time for round 3.
He may be our first 3-time guest.
Yeah, I couldn't think of anyone better to do that with. So thanks again to Chris Moore for keeping us in the loop about his ongoing studies with relation to this mystery that is, this enigma that we call the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis. Now, something else that we should probably talk about in advance of where we're going here is the peopling of the Americas. This is another topic that has long fascinated us, and that's one of the reasons that Jason was able to line up a very special interview for us this week, and that is with Dr. Ben Potter. And I want to give a little background with regard to what we're going to be talking about and what it means. The site that we're going to focus on the most with Dr. Ben Potter is known as the Upward Sun River site. And according to a fact sheet that Dr. Potter produced about this, which we will have linked in the show notes, the name for the site is a geographic place name recorded all the way back in the 1960s. During oral history interviews with 2 native elders, a mother and a daughter, who were from what is called the Salchakat village. These native knowledge bearers were 2 of the last speakers of Middle Tanana language. And the mother, as the story goes, had first-hand knowledge of what is called the Zasana and associated uplands. That, by the way, the indigenous name, but when translated, that means Upward Sun River. This native woman is buried in an elevated cemetery several miles away, overlooking the valley where the ancient remains were found. And we're going to discuss those ancient remains because the Upward Sun River site happens to be, as far as an actual formal burial site, it appears to be the oldest known in North America, and it has yielded a number of fascinating things about the ancient past. So we're going to discuss that when we return right here with Dr. Benjamin Potter on the 7 Ages Audio Journal. Dr. Ben Potter has worked in Alaskan archaeology since 1995, receiving his Ph.D. in 2005 at University of Alaska Fairbanks. Dr. Potter has worked in both academia as an anthropologist at University of Alaska Fairbanks and also has decades of experience in field survey and excavation, spatial analysis, lithic and faunal analysis, intrasite and intersite modeling, and especially as a cultural resource management archaeologist with over 24 years of experience. It's very, very great to have you joining us here on this edition of the 7 Ages Audio Journal.
Thank you, Micah. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. Before we get into this, because we've got so many directions I think we want to go with this conversation, the remarkable Upward Sun site there in Alaska, but also, of course, with regard to migratory routes, the first arrivals into America, the ancient migratory routes they would have taken. Before we get into that, perhaps the best place to start, and I'll follow your lead on this, maybe we can look at what the state of the art with genetic science is telling us, and how we can use that to better inform our judgment in terms of the migratory paths and other aspects of the ancient world that we seek to try and understand.
Sure. I think that's an excellent place to start. Really, in the last 5 years, the amount of information we have been able to glean from the genetic record really has transformed our understanding of the Paleo-Indians, the very earliest Native Americans, who they're related to, the timing of splits in the Old World, as well as potential information that can help us sort out some of these various hypotheses for how they entered into the Americas, but what time, which routes, etc. So I think going sort of encapsulating this material, we can look at from my perspective, the archaeology and the genetics are coalescing and coinciding more and more as we get more information. So to put it in very simple terms, the very earliest split we have, very earliest divergence of Native Americans from their East Asian relatives occurred roughly 35,000 years ago to about 24,000 years ago. So this would have been during a warm period, an interstadial. We can see the last connection sort of breaking around 24,000 years ago or so, where they were no longer admixing with their Asian relatives, or the East Asian relatives. And we know this from the genetics that time coincided roughly with the onset of the last glacial maximum, a relatively cool or cold period in Northeast Asia. And we can say in terms of where they were located, the Native American ancestors would have been somewhere in East Asia. We don't know where, because we don't know, again, where the East Asians populations were at that time. But it's reasonable to posit that it was probably somewhere in China, Mongolia, southern Siberia, somewhere in that region, because they were admixing up till around 24,000 years ago. After 24,000, there was an interesting period of admixture with another population that was in Siberia. And we call these the ancient North Eurasians. And we have a number of individuals. The Malta boy is the most famous, but there's also another human remains at Afontova Gora, around 17,000. And then at the Yana site, which is a relatively recent discovery on the genetic angle. And we know that these people are admixing into Native American ancestors roughly 24,000 to around 20,000 years ago. And I think that's good indication that the Native American ancestors were likely still somewhere in southern Siberia, because that's the only area we have this presence of this ancient North Eurasian group. And then after that, it seems that during the LGM period, the coldest part of that period, there's a divergence where you've got Native Americans sort of isolated. And you've heard of the Beringian standstill hypothesis. Mm-hmm. That's where that comes in, where it appears that they're sort of developing their mtDNA clades in isolation. We suspect it's probably somewhere still in Northeast Asia. And then at the end, we see an expansion and a diversification into the Americas. And from the mtDNA data, we can identify this period at roughly 16,000 to 14,000 years ago. And from the Y-DNA data, we can sort of more limit this period to somewhere between 15,300 and 14,300 years ago. And I think that's when we've got this explosion, this expansion into the Americas. That's kind of a really rough sort of picture on the global scene.
And thank you for that, because the important point to try and drive home here, I think, is understanding the dynamics that were occurring there toward the end of the Pleistocene, and the fact that, again, the migratory path, it may not have been, I guess, as simple as people just walking over. There were a lot of dynamics that were taking place, but fundamentally that the current genetic science, if I understand it correctly, clearly indicates that the ancestors of modern Native American populations, the admixtures ceased to occur before they actually cross over into Beringia. Right. This occurs while they were still there in that northeastern part of Asia, correct?
Right. And I think a good way to think about it with respect to the listeners is I don't really consider this to be like migration as we might imagine, say, at the end of the Roman period, where you have German tribes sort of moving en masse, sort of through Europe. I think a better way to perceive this is population sort of expansion, geographic expansion and retraction with respect to sort of climate change. And I think that's, we're looking at various sort of expansions. We know that there's one during the last interstadial, because we have people all the way as far north as Yana that are related to people further south. That appear to have contracted during the coldest period of the LGM. And then as deglaciation occurred after around 17,000, we see people moving forward, moving north into areas that people previously weren't located at. And I think the expansion into Alaska and into the rest of the Americas is best considered as a geographic or biogeographic expansion of humans.
Funny question for you, Dr. Potter, but could it actually be that we have really, in order to fully understand all these dynamics, that we've really fundamentally needed to rethink the idea of migrations? Because it's like you kind of touched on there tends to be this point-click attitude that, well, people come from one part of the world and they travel to another and then they stay there and then they either blend with the existing populations, or if there's no one there, they settle and they make this their new home. These sorts of dynamics we're talking about are never quite so point and click, are they?
Yeah, and I think on a day-to-day basis, no one in that population would imagine that they're actually migrating. They would just be doing what they always do, doing what their parents did, doing what their grandparents did. It just happens to be a little bit more east or a little bit more north relative to sort of the abundance of game. So I think connecting it with the paleoclimate and resource abundance is really critical, that we don't look at these questions as dots on maps or movements of projectile points, as some people do, but rather, why are people moving at a certain time? Why are they expanding in areas that maybe had less biodiversity or less biomass in earlier periods and are becoming better places to make a living? And I think that's the way I've always framed this question.
Right. Speaking in terms of archaeology, maybe this is a good place where we can step over into the archaeological side of this, because based on what information has been yielded from excavations, both in portions of Eastern Asia and also in the extreme northwestern North American continent, what does the archaeology seem to indicate about the dispersal patterns and movements into North America?
Sure, and that's a complicated question, and I think what I want to do is sort of connect the archaeology with the genetics, as I mentioned.
Sure.
This very early ancient North Eurasian group that I mentioned, that were there in the far north for tens of thousands of years, around Lake Baikal primarily, but there's some extension north. That was a group that was using material we call Middle Upper Paleolithic technology, or the Siberian Middle Upper Paleolithic. It didn't contain microliths or the microblades that are so famous from the later period, and it seems to be a rather sort of generic adaptation to the far north, to the taiga. We know from sites like Malta and Buret, really sort of expansive settlements, larger populations, but they didn't appear to be really mobile in the way that we see in a later period. Right. And they didn't really move so far north. After the LGM, after this cold period 20,000 years ago, the expansion of probably Native American ancestors were using what we term late Upper Paleolithic technology. And this is maybe well known as the Juktai culture, the Juktai tradition, with wedge-shaped microblade cores, lenticular bifaces, willow leaf bifaces, just a wide variety of very specialized tools. And really, the archaeology suggests high mobility, where people can expand in areas, perhaps in areas where they don't know where the toolstone might be, that can act as a means to help with relatively fast-moving or high residential mobility populations. And from the faunal record, it does indicate that they're going after high-ranked resources. Mm-hmm. So by high-ranked, we're talking about big meat packages with lots of fat, lots of protein, lots of energy. And that can enable a relatively small population to expand and to subsist in relatively large territories. We see this in Siberia, and we see it in Alaska too, for the very earliest Beringians. And I think we see it in the lower 48 with Clovis and the early Paleo-Indian groups there, where yes, they subsisted on small, medium game as well, and in some cases birds and fish, but really large game was the predominant focus.
I do want to ask with regard to the specific large game, naturally, again, high fat, high protein is going to give the best bang for the buck, especially if you're on the move, if you are nomadic, if you are even within a localized area, if you're moving in order to survive. So one question I have with regard to the fauna, is there any indication that there was a preference among coastal mammals, seal, walrus, anything like that would have an extremely high protein and fat yield? And I guess you probably see where I'm going with this. Had there been any indication of preference in terms of what was being hunted for food, but which might have yielded results in terms of the coastal factor, which seems to be reasonable, although we'll get to that hypothesis later in some of your thoughts about it, but the coastal component with regard to entry into North America.
Yes, that's a very good question. One element I'd like to emphasize is the nature of the big game hunting that we see enables people to exploit a strategy of high residential mobility. In other words, once you understand how to subsist on bison or mammoth, right, you can take that technology, that adaptation, that knowledge, and you can transfer it wherever there are bison and mammoth. And as we know ecologically, there was a very homogeneous steppe tundra in this far north area, all the way, Lake Baikal north to the Lena Basin, the Kolyma, all the way over into Alaska where I work. And you have a very high biomass of these grazers, right? So what that really enabled people to do was essentially, once they figured this out, you can expand relatively rapidly. You don't have to relearn local fauna, local adaptations. And that's very different from many coastal areas and many sort of what we might think of as Mesolithic strategies or archaic strategies, where you intensively map onto a local resource. Well, that's great for where you're at, but you can't really transfer that knowledge easily. So to answer your specific question, we really have no evidence of coastal exploitation in most of that Northeast Asian region until the mid-Holocene. Around 6,000 years, we see a little bit better evidence of this after 4,000 years ago, but nothing in the early Holocene and nothing in the late Pleistocene. So the Juktai culture, as I mentioned, really was focused on interior terrestrial fauna, as was the earliest Alaskans, and arguably as was the earliest Paleo-Indians in North and South America. And we can get more specific on that later, but it really is a terrestrial adaptation.
Right.
And, as we continue to explore the migration routes, and I think that's key to much of the conversation that we're going to have here today, I know without a doubt, because several people, knowing that this interview was coming up, had these questions kind of, preordained for us, if you will. What do we make of the pre-Clovis sites that are so often discussed throughout the continental, United States and other places? What do we make of those pre-Clovis sites to the discussion of the isolation of the peoples up in Alaska? Are we looking at the same genetic traits, or is it a completely different conversation?
So this is a really, really complicated question, and I'll try to answer it in a number of ways. So we'll start with, in terms of the genetics, I took you as far as the Native American ancestors, that they're in somewhere in Northeast Asia during this standstill, this incubation period. And then after 15,300 or so, between 15,300 and 14,300 years ago, they're expanding. Well, we have more information about them over the last year. Particularly, there's been a number of papers. I've been on a couple of them as co-author, and this gives us a little bit more insight. So first off, we can say the earliest split of Native Americans was ancient Beringians from all of the other Native Americans. And this occurred somewhere around 17,000, 18,000 years ago, and probably occurred in Asia. So we're talking about at least two migrations. There's some arguments that have been made as to, what this might represent. But I think for our purposes, it's enough to say that they expanded into Alaska and surrounding regions and really stayed put for thousands of years, and they didn't really make it further south. So I think, that can be on its own, right? Ancient Beringians up in Alaska. I suspect they probably migrated over around 12,500 years ago or so. But anyway, that's that. Now we've got the main branch of Native Americans, and we know that they split into two basal groups. We call them North Native Americans and South Native Americans. Some papers call them ANC-A and ANC-B, but we'll just call them NNA and SNA for now. Now, NNA, so this split probably happened around 17 to 14,000. We don't know when in that period. My suspicion, it was probably towards the later part of that. And so the NNA really seemed to be limited to sort of the area of Canada and further north, and we don't really see them expanding further south. SNA is the group that essentially was the progenitor of the other Native Americans all the way from Washington State down to the tip of South America. So that's the group that we're interested in, SNA. And the most recent data, so Anzik, of course, is the Clovis individual. That is SNA, right? most recently, Eski Villerslev and David Reich, two different genetics groups, have published. I think it was 2018. At the end of 2018, they published some details on this SNA group. So we have Spirit Cave, also SNA. We have Lago Asanta, around 10,000 years old in South America. And they're all SNA, but they're various sublineages. And what we see is a star-like radiation, which it interprets, we can interpret as a very rapid radiation of related populations. Now, from the dating of the split times, we know that this is going to be somewhere around 14.1 to 12.9 in terms of the Southern American group, sort of the last common ancestor between the two. So this is late. So this is later than Monteverde. This fits really nicely with what we understand about sort of Clovis expansion and the fishtail fluted point expansion in South America. So from my perspective, what we should expect to see on the genetic front is a very rapid expansion of related populations, right? And there is only one continent-wide manifestation, and that's Clovis. And in the south, it's the related fishtail point complex all over South America at exactly the right time we would expect from this from the split times. So then your question gets to, what about sites that are older than 14,000 or 14,500? Well, there's a number of answers we could give. On one hand, from my perspective, each site needs to be evaluated independently. And there's a number of issues with each of the sites that have been proposed as pre-Clovis. I don't have a pony in the game. I don't work at those sites. They could be bona fide. Perhaps there could be issues with association of the dates and the cultural material. There's lots of potential issues with a number of them, as I mentioned. But I think it's not out of reason to expect that there should be about 1,000 years of sort of Clovis-related population ancestors that might be at such low numbers on the landscape that we might not pick them up. In other words, we pick them up at around 13.5, which is when there's enough of them that we can sort of recover them. They're visible in the archaeological record. So we have, on the one case, perhaps some of these sites aren't, the association is problematic, or the site integrity could be problematic. On the other hand, they could represent populations for which we don't have ancestors, right, in the Americas now. So the genetic sort of data, we're looking at Native American direct ancestors. And so it's possible they could be failed migrations if the sites are legitimate.
Oftentimes that conversation is padded with most of these, or a great number of these sites being found on the East Coast. So they're saying, if this is where they're coming in from the West and from Alaska, whether it be the Kelp Highway, whether it be the coastal route, or whether it be an expansion across the top of the continent, why do we see these sites occurring so far to the east? And so that conversation, always comes back to how fast could what we call Clovis have moved across the country from the west to the east. And then, of course, there's explanations of Clovis technology actually developing within the United States and moving from the east to the west. So,
I think to help with the framing, it might be helpful, again, to look at what the genetics is sort of ruling out. And I think for those sites that have been argued to be roughly 14.5 or so, or later, there's no reason to suspect that's not inconsistent with the genetics. But for those sites that are argued to be 15, 16, 17,000 or older, I think the genetics is probably telling us that there could be issues with whether the artifacts are real, are they geofacts, or are they actual artifacts? Are they displaced from secondary contexts? Or are the dates that we're getting not necessarily connected to the archaeology? And I think the way I've looked at it, it almost feels like we have two Paleo-Indian archaeologies ongoing. One is focused on large, robust patterns where we have hundreds of sites. We see patterns broad scale. We can evaluate social organization, procurement, subsistence strategies, right? That's one perspective. And I like that because I like patterns. I'm not interested in anomalies so much. And then the second is this search for the earliest, which these sites remain scattered, hundreds or thousands of miles away from each other. They're unlike each other. Monteverde doesn't look like anything in the north, or for that matter in Northeast Asia. And from my perspective, it doesn't give us a lot of anthropological headway if we don't have robust patterns where we can have more robust sample sizes.
Right.
So I don't know what they mean, but they're less interesting to me than the broader patterns, which seem to be connecting quite well with the genetics.
Right. And, one of the issues I guess we have is this idea that, well, the Clovis culture, this comes back to something, Dr. Potter, that you said earlier. Rather than just looking at lithic types as being the sole identifiers, you can learn a lot of things about where these things appear, their temporal placement, but you have talked about, in numerous papers that you've written or co-authored, you've talked about unambiguous pre-Clovis versus the idea that there may be what are stratigraphically what appear to be what we call earlier than Clovis, but in which case, if we don't have clear representations of lithic technology there, we may actually just be looking at the earlier ranges of Clovis, and genetically, certainly, like you're saying, they're within that 14.5 and more recent period, something that is completely in keeping with what genetics is telling us about Native American populations. So the question kind of becomes one of, are all pre-Clovis sites really pre-Clovis per se, or merely the upper margin of what we would identify as Clovis, or whatever culture created the technology we identify as Clovis?
Right. So there's a couple of things I could say. One, Todd Suravel wrote a paper a few years back that I think was really relevant, which was a sort of a demographic analysis of, okay, we start picking up Clovis sites at roughly 13.5 or so. How much earlier might we expect that in terms of just random sampling? How much earlier, what might we expect that population to be there at smaller numbers? And I think he came up with something like 1,100 years or over a millennia. And I think that's not unreasonable since we're talking about very small populations. We know from the genetics this is a really small group that started. So it's highly unlikely we're going to pick up the very first. We wouldn't even know it. So you're right. I think sites like Page-Ladson, sites like the Galt pre-Clovis material, the Friedkin pre-Clovis material, that could easily be related to Clovis. And so that I think that's an important point. The other point I would mention is we don't really have pre-Clovis, and I mean substantially pre-Clovis human remains. And when we look at the very earliest sort of humans we have, like at Anzik, they are clearly this southern group, and there is no other group further south than the southern group, if you know what I mean. So there's no expectation that this SNA population we're encountering anybody else. Right. So this strongly, I think, indicates that this rapid star-like radiation relatively quickly in geological time really does map onto a single population that split into sublineages upon entry into North America and then rapidly radiated throughout the Americas. This is really not consistent with a scattering of sites, 30,000 years here, 25,000 here, 17,000 here. It really doesn't look like that. And so I suspect that maybe some of these very early purported sites they're inconsistent with the genetics, whereas something along the lines of 15,000, 14.5 is not necessarily unreasonable.
Right. And to bring it back to something you've touched on briefly here, again, the identification of Clovis and fishtail technologies respective to North and South America as the first widely recognized cultural manifestations that we can reliably use to kind of gauge the temporality of these pockets, again, rather than just being one here, one there like you're talking about. In one of your papers, if I may quote you, you wrote that you and your co-authors, we note that both point types are continent-wide in North and South America, respectively. They are the only point types with such broad distributions that are consistent with colonizing processes, although they might also represent communication of ideas among low-density early populations. So on the subject of dispersal of populations in North America, what are we talking about when we describe something like low-density populations and the wide dispersal of technology among them, in your view?
Yeah, so I think that was just capturing all of the possibilities. I think of the two, so how to phrase this? So one vision, I guess one hypothesis that people might have is that there was a single band, right, or macro band, or a group of closely related bands that entered North America either on the coast or in the southern end of the ice-free corridor, and then they just expanded in some colonization process that we might imagine. That's the first part of that sentence that you read. The second part, this low density, would be there's nothing to reject, or there's no reason to reject hypothesis where there could be multiple expansions of related populations at various times through these either the ice-free corridor or the coast. So maybe you've got a group of related bands. Let's hypothetically say, 14,700 years ago, then at 14,500, 200 years later, there's another group that comes and they carry with them another set of material culture. So there's nothing to rule that out either. And so I think that's the two potential possibilities that we were trying to encapsulate in that. I think the fact that we've got relatively complicated sublineages forming relatively rapidly suggests just that even though you have a small group of populations at the beginning, you've got an entire continent. Well, you have two continents, and very quickly you can lead to the development of sublineages from that basal group. Another thing I want to mention, you didn't bring it up, but I think it bears mentioning, is the disconnect with the lithic analysis in the lower 48 from the material in Siberia, Northeast Asia, and Beringia.
Yes.
And I think I want to touch on that briefly.
Yeah, let's do.
So these early Paleo-Indian groups, right? People focus on projectile points as some kind of stylistic indicator, right, of ethnicity. There's problems with that, but let's just take that as a given. And a relatively generic set of tools. There have been a number of analyses by Ted Gable and others on the, sort of the relationship between sort of what we'd expect the basal technologies to look like. And we've got a really nice suite of that in the late Upper Paleolithic in Northeast Asia. It's very clear, right, that there's a wide variety of blade technology, microblade technology, burins, projectile points made of bifaces, slotted points, just a wide variety of Upper Paleolithic materials. Clovis has a smaller suite, a smaller subset. It doesn't contain the microblade technology, for instance. And I think the problem is people have been looking in Alaska for fluted points, right? Mm-hmm. And I think that's probably a problem. What I suspect is the case is that because you have a bottleneck, and we know this again from the genetics, that it's either along the coast or it's in this ice-free corridor, but there's every reason to suspect that sort of a bottleneck effect occurred, where you have people that exited this sort of constriction and had a suite or developed a suite of material culture that was very different, right, from the what people were using in the north. And so I think what I've said in the past is the question isn't why did people invent fluting, which seems to be on everybody's mind, because I think the answer is pretty clear. Fluting was developed in North America. I mean, I think there's every evidence indicates that's an innovation that occurred south of the ice sheets. I think a better question is why was microblade technology dropped from the tool set or the suite of technological adaptations that these people had? And because I suspect we're dealing with small groups of people over a relatively quick amount of time, that might be unanswerable, right? That's just it's a bottleneck effect. It's a genetic drift, right, or an analog to genetic drift. And so we're kind of looking for answers in the wrong sort of way, and that's been largely this disconnect with Northeast Asian material and Alaskan, which is very similar, and the Paleo-Indian technology of the lower 48 and further south.
So, looking at this, when people are discussing paleo types, especially in North America, they tend to focus on Clovis, and then they move into post things like redstones, gainies, different types as you move forward in time. But there's other types that were existing contemporaneous with Clovis, at least as it's discussed. So I would like to get your feedback and your opinion on those who would argue that point styles like the western stemmed point that we see at Cooper's Ferry in Idaho possibly predate the Clovis technology, then again arguing for that earlier group of people being here. What do we make of that sort of thing with the western stem point?
Yeah, so I guess I would edit maybe the comment that there are multiple types that are coterminous, because as far as I understand, Western stemmed is really the only one that has been argued to be contemporaneous or earlier. I am, maybe Goshen, but that's clearly very similar to Clovis more broadly. From my perspective, again, I'm looking at broader patterns, and I think it's been pretty well established that the vast majority of sites with secure dates that have these Western stemmed points are all dating to roughly the Younger Dryas period, so 12,500 to 10,000, something along those lines. And really, we have sort of one, maybe two sites that are argued to substantially predate that. Cooper's Ferry is one of those. And from my perspective, it's an intriguing site, but to establish, substantial antiquity beyond this broader suite of dates, which we have in good context, I think you need more than what has been presented so far at Cooper's Ferry. So I'll say I'm agnostic about the age of that material. What I can say with respect to genetics is there's nothing in the genetics that would indicate a bifurcation where you'd have a genetic group of related individuals that are only in that area where Western stemmed occurred, and then Clovis related as a distinct population elsewhere. What the genetics argues for more specifically would be a single broad homogeneous tradition of related populations that are occurring at roughly around the same time. And that's what we see with Clovis. So I'd also mention that there are Clovis, undated, but Clovis materials that are well, in the West, in areas where we see stemmed points later in time. So that also, I think, would argue that this seems to be a later phenomenon. But yeah, as far as Cooper's Ferry, I don't think they've unequivocally demonstrated the link between the radiocarbon samples and those stemmed points.
Right. On the coastal migrations side of this, there are so many other aspects that should be addressed, but one that I think we absolutely need to make sure that we cover, because you've written extensively about this in recent months, in fact, has to do with the general widespread acceptance, I feel, of the coastal idea and its relationship to lithic types that are appearing on the western coast. In your view, this has been a bit presumptive and a bit maybe jumping ahead of the game, because you would argue, if I'm correct in my understanding, that some of the data may not be as conclusive as it has been argued by both the academic community and also the media. Could you elaborate on that side of this?
Sure. I think it's a fine hypothesis to have, but it is contradicted by a wide variety of data. And I'll just point out some of the issues that I see. More broadly, I have written that we should be agnostic about the routes of entry, and there could easily be more than one route because we're dealing with more than one population. Certainly ancient Beringians, North and South Native Americans as distinctive groups, depending on where they split. So on the one hand, I would just emphasize that on the genetic front, again, the connections we see with Native American ancestors and Asian relatives are all in interior context. So for instance, between 24,000 and 20,000 years ago, we see admixture between ancient North Eurasians with individuals like Malta and Afantovagara, with ancient Native Americans, and that is in deep interior southern Siberia. They're nowhere near the coast. We do know of the Jomon tradition, for instance, in coastal northern Japan, and also interior, where we now have genetic data from ancient individuals of ancient Jomon individuals, and we know, or we can now say definitively, that these populations are very much disconnected with Native American ancestors. There's no indication there was any close relationship between them. And so even further than, say, the North Eurasians or Siberian relatives of Native Americans, strongly suggesting that there was no recent link or no close link between sort of coastal peoples, the earliest coastal peoples we have in Japan, for instance, and Native Americans. So that's one set of data we do have. We also have a wide variety of evidence and lack of evidence in the far northern coastal areas. So the Kuril Islands, the northern coast of the Sea of Okhotsk, the Kamchatka Peninsula, Chukotka, and into Alaska, we don't have any evidence of coastal adaptations or coastal exploitation until the Middle Holocene. So thousands of years after coastlines stabilized, if sites were there, we would see them. On the converse, what we actually see are very much interior adapted populations, the Eastern Beringian tradition, the Denali tradition, and later the first peoples we do see on the coast, like at the Anangula site, these are interior peoples related to Denali tradition that expanded to the coast. And we did an obsidian analysis looking at sort of the earliest exploitation of coastal obsidian, and that was very much later than the early interior use of obsidian, really strongly argues against a coastal migration in Beringia. Now, most of the work that people have done in terms of some of these early sites is from, say, the Alexander Archipelago, which is, southeast Alaska, around Juneau, that area, further south to, say, Puget Sound. And that's, of course, part of the equation. But the search for refugia, we don't really have much evidence at all for this, for the vast stretch of southern Beringia. We just simply don't have the data. And the earliest site we have along that coastal area from Puget Sound north is only 12,500 years old. And of course, that's 1,500 years or more after the earliest interior peoples that we see. And I wanted to emphasize that. That's where it stands right now. And then the final piece is this argument of stemmed points, which has been promulgated primarily in the media, but there are a couple of papers talking about it. And I remain unconvinced, and my colleagues, for the most part, remain unconvinced up here, that there's a secure connection, a technological connection that has been demonstrated between sort of the wide variety of stem-like materials and, say, the Ushki sites, with the Jamon, insipid Jamon stem points, with this Western stem tradition. And that would really be required to establish a connection. Right now we have a series of, just from the formal outlines of these pieces, some similar forms that have been selected and illustrated together. And of course that, from an anthropological perspective, misses the point of looking at these tools in the context of technological systems. And that hasn't been done to date yet.
Well, those are fair, questions that you're raising. And, I think we should, from time to time, slow the roll and not get ahead of ourselves. And that's, part of not just the archaeological process, but the scientific process in general. Jason?
It makes perfect sense to look at these things, critically, with much focus and take the time to find out what's actually there to present as evidence. But, while all of those things are fascinating and key importance to the conversation, really what we've brought you on today, Dr. Potter, today to talk about is the Upward Sun River site in Alaska. Now, this has gotten some press. I've been following it for quite a while now, and I know as being directly involved with the site, you would be certainly the best person to speak on behalf of the Upward Sun River site in Alaska. So if you could begin with an overview of the site for listeners who may not be familiar with it, and then we can get into the details from there.
Sure. We originally found it. We discovered it in 2007 as part of 2006 as part of a railroad expansion project. So believe it or not, railroads are still being built up here. And so we did a survey into sand dunes, the Little Delta Dune Field. We identified that there was probably good likelihood that there would be preserved sites with good stratigraphy and deeply buried sites. And we discovered a series of about 8 sites, one of which was the Upward Sun site. We began analysis in 2007 with a block excavation. At that point, we had enough to know that there were multiple occupations dating back all the way to 13,300 years ago. So there's actually a series of older occupations than the main one, which we've published on more recently. And then I secured some National Science Foundation funding in 2010, and we've had a series of large excavations opening up over 270 square meters. And so we've got a really nice window into a residential campsite, roughly dating to around 11,500 years ago. So right at the end of the last ice age and the beginning of the Holocene period. And so we have a series of probably 3 residential features So these would be tent-like features, but it suggests a longer period of occupation. From the faunal analyses and the floral analyses, we know this was a summer occupation, so probably dating to sort of the beginning of August, so late summer. And we have, of course, the most important find are 3 human remains, 3 individuals that were buried in the context of a single complicated feature. And so I kind of need to walk you through the feature so you can understand the complications.
Yes, absolutely.
So I'll kind of go backwards from the discovery because, of course, we found the uppermost remains first, and then the lower 2 infants we found second. But that's kind of the reverse order of what happened. So what we understand at Upward Sun River is we have a group of people with women, children, older people, probably a local band that was camping in early August, 11,500 years ago, in the Tanana Basin in central Alaska. There, we know that they were fishing for salmon, that they were capturing locally acquired small game. So these would be ground squirrel, hare, ptarmigan, or grouse, this sort of thing. And we know that 2 infants died. One was a 6-week-old, and another was an infant or a fetal remain. Both were female. And they were buried within the central hearth of one of these tent features, about 90 centimeters down. They dug through the hearth. They laid these 2 infants to rest with grave goods, including weapons, and we'll talk about them in a bit. They reburied these 2 infants and continued using the central hearth later in the summer. And then a 3-year-old died and was cremated in that central hearth. And after that cremation, it looks like they burnt the structure, backfilled, and then abandoned the site. So we have 3 individuals at the site. The genetic work that has been done and published in 2016 and 2018 were from the 2 buried infants. They were buried in full articulation. There's no burning. There's no real damage to the tissue. So we've got really high quality genetic material from them. The 3rd individual was highly cremated and burned, and so we've yet to have success with the genetics there. But so this is, of course, amazing. This is the earliest human remains we have for the Arctic or subarctic by far. And I can talk a little bit about the genetic results a little bit later, but I can talk a little bit about some of the other remains that we found. So first we have the first evidence, the earliest evidence of human exploitation of salmon in all of the Americas. So prior to this, we know that there was some early coastal use of salmon, maybe 8,000, 9,000 years ago. And of course, that's what we understand now. We kind of expect sort of the Pacific Northwest, heavy salmon use. Well, the earliest use of salmon is actually at this site in the deep interior of Alaska, and in fact, almost at the furthest range of modern salmon. So that's pretty exciting. We've got genetic results and stable isotope results to show that they were chum salmon and that they were anadromous. So we have, I think, emerging a very different picture of Paleo-Indians up here in Alaska, where it's not just big game hunting that was dominant, but you also had sort of use of fish. We now know they were using freshwater fish like burbot, pike, as well as salmon, and a wide range of small game as well. And we've been doing macrofossil analysis too, where we know that they're going after berries that would be ripening during this period, like bearberry, blueberry, nagoonberry, and using other sorts of plants like cinquefoil that might be edible, as well as sedges, which may be used for basketry and things of that nature. So we're getting a more well-rounded picture of subsistence in the far north.
A couple of questions about the salmon, because you're right, that's incredibly interesting. With this being the first evidence of this being a subsistent, maybe a staple of subsistence in that region, does it seem to indicate anything about the time of the year during which the encampment, because I know that you indicate your belief when this encampment might have actually been utilized, the time of the year. But with regard to the idea of like the salmon runs and things along those lines, is there any indication that the people were moving through that area following a pattern like that in nature? an annual salmon run or something along those lines.
Yeah, so rather than a belief, I would say
right.
It's an inference that we're making from a variety of data.
Yeah,
so
poor choice of words on my part.
It's okay, because it's very difficult to establish seasonality, and we've been really, I guess, focusing on that because, of course, that relates to the tissue formation for these two infants. And right now, it's really on my mind because we're working on a paleo diet paper. These two individuals had different mothers, so we're actually getting high quality, high resolution stable isotope data on the mothers' diets. So two different people within this ancient Beringian population. And so it's very important for us to really pin down the time of year. So we have immature ground squirrel long bones. So we know what time of year they're born. We know what time of year these, we would be getting the immature ground squirrel present. We also know now when the chum salmon runs are, at least locally. And so we can combine them with the bearberry, the nagoonberry, for when those are fruiting, to indicate a very tight span of time in early August. So we're looking at roughly a 3-week period or 2.5-week period in early August. And this is really precise and really helpful for us to understand tissue formation. And so we're actually, I can't report on that now because we're writing it up.
Sure.
But we have a really high resolution picture emerging for those diets in basically late spring and throughout the summer for these populations. So it's very exciting.
That is outstanding. I mean, such specificity, and you don't usually see that going this far back. I mean, for a site of that antiquity, that is really remarkable.
And I think that underscores the importance of having more than one individual. Most, analyses where you're looking at sort of paleo diets, and there hasn't been that much, and also genetics rely on sort of single individuals like Anzik, right, or Spirit Cave. Here we have two, so we can begin to sort of flesh out sort of the perspectives on these early populations. So, for instance, the empty DNA haplogroups are different, right? We have C1b and B2, the two totally different haplogroups, but they're in a single small population. And that, we argued, further emphasizes that we're probably dealing with a long period of sort of the standstill hypothesis, where you have this merging and emergence, I guess, of multiple clades, multiple empty DNA haplogroups in Siberia, and then you have various proportions of these haplogroups in these various populations as they enter the New World. So some people have this idea, there's an X2A group of people moving, or there's a D2 group of people moving. That's really not the case. It's likely just subsets of populations with various sort of percentages of these haplogroups. And so having two individuals that have different mothers is, of course, very exciting to begin to explore those differences. Right now, we think they're highly related. And they're probably at the level of either half sibling or first cousin. So that gives us a further information about, the group size, that you probably have multiple related families at this residential camp. And I think also underscores the high infant mortality that we're probably dealing with. And of course, recent hunter-gatherer studies, we understand that foragers often have high infant mortality rates. And what we see with 3 young individuals dying probably within a few weeks of each other in the summer, the time period when we'd expect the highest amount of resource diversity and abundance, really underscores how difficult life might have been for these early Paleo-Indian groups.
Going back to the burials themselves for a moment, you'd mentioned that one of them was in a cremated state and the other 2 were not. So what can we infer from that alone? Is there any sort of ritual? Is there anything there that we can speculate on as to why that would be the case?
Yeah, that's one of the most profound elements of our discoveries. And this is this notion of ideology. So, it's relatively straightforward to reconstruct ancient technology and even ancient subsistence, but to understand, what people were thinking, what they considered to be important, is difficult to do. So what we can say from the material at Upward Sun River, the burials, the 2 infant burials, they were placed side by side. The older infant was in a fetal position with arms crossed over her chest, with her legs highly flexed, the knees around the chest area. Probably they were both within a shroud, so they would have been wrapped in something that kept them flexed in a flexed position. And directly next to these two female infants were grave goods. And these were 4 bibeveled antler rods, so probably made out of elk antler, and 2 of which had projectile points directly affixed to them. Now, the bindings, we don't have the bindings anymore, but they're positioned right at the edge of one of the bevels. And 2 of them would be essentially foreshafts and attached dart points. And they were all, 3 of the 4 had decorations, X-mark decorations on them. And the entire floor of this burial pit was totally covered with red ochre. And all of the sides of the bones had red ochre as well. So it looks like red ochre was used. Essentially, they were covered. They were dusted with red ochre before putting them into the burial. So there's a lot of insights we can gain from that. The one that I would like to highlight is that even though we have evidence of a broad spectrum diet, so fish, we've got terrestrial birds, we've got small game like hare and ground squirrel, but we also have very large mammal remains. Now, we don't know what they are, right? We've got DNA analyses ongoing to identify what they are. But from other sites in the region at the same time period, we know that bison and elk were the 2 most common animals that were captured. And I think what this is telling us is that even though these are female infants, even though we've got evidence of a broad spectrum diet, the elements that they found important enough to incorporate into a burial ritual were in fact the high-ranked megafaunal capture equipment, the projectile points and associated foreshafts. That's what they considered important enough to bury with these 2. And I think that's profound. It suggests that there may be an emphasis, even though they may have a broad spectrum diet, there does seem to be an ideological preference or emphasis on big game hunting technology. So as far as the difference, so why these 2 infants were treated differently than the third of the 3-year-old that was cremated with no burial goods, I think it could be a number of different things. One argument, one hypothesis could be that there's an age grade difference. Like, for instance, a 3-year-old may be old enough to have already been given a name, right? To be given the spirit has, entered into them, and there's an ensoulment that may have happened. There's some evidence for differential treatment of younger versus older children in the Upper Paleolithic of Europe, for instance, and that could be happening. But what I suspect actually is happening, and it's another hypothesis, is that they related to who was present at the site. If we have a site that's occupied in the summer, the earlier part of summer, which is when the 2 infants died, it's possible that the males were at the site as well, particularly the groups that would later go out for logistical hunting forays. And we know this from sites like Gersel River, where you've got a narrow range of weapons, only big game and no small game at all, and relatively short duration of occupation. That really looks like a logistical hunting camp. Well, we know in the summer that some of these populations were moving hunting camps into areas where caribou and sheep were dominant in the summer, which was not where Upward Sun River is. Upward Sun River is low lying; it's right next to a major river. The later hunting, logistical hunting, would happen relatively far away. So it's possible when the 3-year-old died later, the males weren't there, and you didn't have the hunting equipment there. Now, we do have some evidence of this with respect to the other features that were occupied at the same time, where one of them, it's a relatively minor part of the assemblage, but we do have weapon maintenance and retooling. But for the most part, most of the site looks like expedient use of scraper forms and modified flakes, very much consistent with sort of a residential base camp of certainly women and children, and perhaps some men as well. So I think we're probably seeing a perspective that's basically contingency, like who was present when the infants died.
I do have another question I want to add to Jason's question with regard to ritual. With regard to the burial of the lithic samples that are found alongside the 2 infants, ochre had been dispersed around these, but am I correct in my understanding that had not been the case entirely with the rhyolite blade? or perhaps I have this backwards. There was an ochre coating on the rhyolite blade, but not on the other projectiles, only partially on some of those. Is that correct?
Yeah, so red ochre, there's a stain across the bottom of the feature. Definitely there's a dusting on the rhyolite, which was not hafted. It was kind of just by itself and clearly not a projectile point.
Okay.
The bibeveled rods themselves were totally covered with ochre, and for the most part on the basal forms of the two points. Now, of course, this is going to be a little bit more difficult to fully pin down because the points themselves, the pointed ends of the bifaces, were at the extreme edge of the pit feature itself, and so it could be. I wouldn't necessarily get into whether they were preferentially avoided with respect to the dusting or not. But my suspicion is probably all of the tools were dusted with this highly visible red material, which is a really common sort of accoutrement to burials sort of across the Paleolithic, from Europe all the way into the Americas. I remember as I was doing research for the burial, there's a Paleolithic site in Czechoslovakia, I believe, which also had a double infant burial just coated with ochre as well. I'm not making any connections.
Sure.
What I mean is that's a very common treatment of the dead sort of throughout the ancient world.
Yeah, it's fascinating. Well, I do have one more aspect with regard to the hearths themselves. Had it also been inferred from the fact that there didn't appear to be any explicit faunal disposal areas that these hearths were also used for bone disposal?
Yeah, that's another exciting element of Upward Sun River. I want to emphasize that in many Paleontological studies, for the most part, we get short-term hunting camps, right? In terms of where we look, sort of the search image that we have. And that's, of course, true up here in Alaska as well. Most of the sites, we're getting one portion of the broader settlement system. And I think that's largely been a problem because, again, the social organization, the relationship of sort of settlement use to different kinds of resources, lithic and fauna, are going to structure the material culture, obviously. And so what we see with Upward Sun River is a really nice counterpoint to some of the logistical hunting sites that I mentioned, where, for instance, microblades are much more common. So we don't have microblades at Upward Sun River, but the time period that we're talking about, there are many, many sites in the region with other parts of this Denali toolkit, which include microblades. And so I think that's an interesting sort of component to sort of emphasize is the treatment of material is different. So for instance, at hunting camps, you largely have very expedient processing of the big game where you can have maybe articulated sets of vertebrae, for instance, that are just kind of left there. And it's quite scattered. So people were breaking, bones for marrow. It seems like they're removing the high meat yield portions to take somewhere else, likely sites like Upward Sun River. There does seem to be more elements like space cleaning or space maintenance. And so for longer term camps, that's exactly what you'd expect, that if you've got smelly sort of refuse from consumption events, you're going to end up, putting those in the fire, sweeping them into the fire. And so it's very interesting pattern we see where almost all of the fallen remains are directly in the hearths in burnt form, and we have very little in the way of fallen remains outside the hearths.
There is such an extraordinary amount of information coming out of this site, Dr. Potter, and as we're kind of winding down, it's been a real treat to talk with you about this because I know it's kind of reshaping my idea of the ancient world, and if there's any way that you could communicate to the listener, the big picture, the takeaway, what have we learned from this site that is, as we are studying it, reshaping how we understand people of this period, contemporaneous with Clovis here in North America, migrations, their way of life, their ritual, their belief systems, all of these things. How is this picture now coming together with the studies that have been produced from this site?
Well, I think I would first start by saying that the work that I've done at Upward Sun River and the team that we're connected with on the genetics front, the stable isotope front, paleoecology front, geoarchaeology, all of these elements sort of combine where we look at Upward Sun in the context of all of the other sites that we're working at. So, for instance, the Delta River Overlook site is another really important site that presents another facet of these ancient Beringians here in Alaska. And sites like Ursel River, Broken Mammoth, Swan Point all add in their various sort of elements. And I guess from my perspective, I would emphasize the complexity of the lifeways, particularly the need to understand social organization, who are present at the sites, what time of year are they present, what sort of resources are they using, because what we're seeing is that there's lots of complexity and lots of variability as they're basically as complex as modern hunter-gatherers, of course, which lead very rich spiritual lives, very rich sort of ideological connections and patternings with their environment. And so there's no reason to suspect that it's not as complicated and as complex in this very early period as well. And the fact that they're able and they have the technology, they have the wherewithal to understand sort of seasonal aggregations of resources, like, for instance, waterfowl at certain times of the year, salmon at other times. They're probably taking advantage of freshwater fish runs as well. It provides, I think, a counterbalance to this idea of just mammoth hunters moving across a steppe, which I think, even though I emphasize sort of the megafaunal aspect early on, I think a richer and more realistic perspective on these ancient peoples is that while they did practice some specialization with respect to big game hunting, that only scratches the surface of the broader lifeways that they utilized as they moved from the old world into the Americas.
Dr. Potter, if you wouldn't mind, maybe you could give us also a statement on the relevance of archaeology today, because we see so many advancements in different areas of the sciences, astronomy, physics, chemistry. I do feel from time to time, despite its popularity, that archaeology is sometimes kind of, left at the back of the list. It's so entirely relevant to understanding the human way because, it is, after all, the human story. Maybe we could get your thoughts on that.
Sure, Micah. I think the way my perspective on archaeology is that we are humans. All the people in the New World, all of the Native American ancestors, we are humans, right? We're all part of the same species. And understanding our capacities, understanding how we develop through time is really important to understanding the human condition. And with respect to my research in the far north, we have in the Arctic and subarctic some of the most inhospitable areas on the planet, and some of the latest occupations of humans on the planet as we expanded from Africa throughout the Europe and Asia and into the Americas. And so for me, understanding that human environment interaction becomes critical. We are part of the natural world. We're part of the ecosystems here in the far north. And in terms of the relevance today, we're looking at some pretty major climate changes, and it's affecting ocean temperatures. It's affecting vegetation. It's affecting animal life throughout the north. The last major time period of major climate change was at this last Pleistocene Holocene transition from the last ice age into the Holocene. And that's some of the questions that we're engaged in is, why did people expand north during the deglaciation? Why weren't they here earlier? What capacities, what technologies did they have to adapt? And most importantly, how did they manage to still stay resilient and sustainable in their lifeways through some major climatic transitions? And I think that offers some lessons to us as we move forward in understanding our role in the Arctic and subarctic during modern climate change now.
If one thing is for certain, it is that change is inevitable, but humans also persist. They have done it since time immemorial. We will do it again as we meet new changes. Dr. Potter, thank you again for joining us on the 7 Ages Audio Journal.
Thank you. I've enjoyed talking with you as well.
Special thanks again to Dr. Ben Potter for joining us. I know that I mirror Jason's sentiments when I say that that was an in-depth conversation that has fundamentally changed the way I'm looking at some sites we've been looking at since we began the 7 Ages Research Associates. Now, as we're concluding here, James, I thought that it was high time that we catch up on a segment we have not featured on this program in a while. That is, of course, known colloquially here as Famous Feuds.
I challenge you to a duel.
Now go away or I shall taunt you a second time. Go on, get.
Famous Feuds. That is right. This is a unique kind of a feud here. It's not a feud between famous historical personalities. No, this is actually a feud that has occurred of the picturesque variety because it involves a battle between two famous paintings. It is arguably the best known, the most visited, the most written about, the most sung about, and the most parodied work of art in the world. It is also the most highly insured piece of artwork in the world, and that, of course, is the famous Mona Lisa painted by Leonardo da Vinci in the early 1500s. And the subject of the painting is widely believed by art historians to be that of Lisa Gherardini, who was the wife of Francesco del Giocondo. Now, this famous painting, again, is believed to have been painted between 1503 and 1506. They say that Leonardo may have continued working on it as late as 1517. The most recent academic work suggests that it wouldn't have been started before 1513. But that doesn't mean that he hadn't been working on this or a similar project much earlier, because it may not be the only one. Now, imagine if we go back in the 1960s. We enter a apartment flat in London, and there's a painting depicting the Mona Lisa hanging over a fireplace. But it looks a little different. It doesn't look quite like the Mona Lisa that we all know. In fact, it looks like the same subject, but maybe she's a little younger. Otherwise, it's the exact same painting. And the BBC recently reported on this, asking, is this picture not only by Leonardo da Vinci, but also an earlier version of the world-famous portrait that hangs in the Louvre Museum in Paris? BBC says some people are convinced it is, and more than 50 years later, a bitter battle has erupted over both the ownership of the picture and the evidence about who painted it. Again, to borrow the wording of the BBC, they say it is a Leonardo da Vinci feud, but a feud between those who are proponents for the one famous painting and those who are saying, actually, there may be two of them. So this so-called earlier Mona Lisa is at the heart of a mystery that involves Caribbean tax havens, Swiss bank vaults, a mysterious international consortium, and the Sherlock Holmes of the art world. It is the likes of which you would expect to, well, I guess hear about in the Da Vinci Code or some similar Dan Brown novel. But the BBC reported on some very curious aspects of all this. They say that since the Mona Lisa is possibly the world's most famous painting, and its painter is regarded as one of history's greatest artists, such a find would turn the world of art upside down. Now, the foundation that is associated with this set out an array of evidence to try to back up the claim that the painting was a second, previously unknown version of the portrait, although arguably, while we're saying it's a second, it probably predates the one that is more well known. But curiously, they say the organization claims it doesn't own the painting. It says the picture is owned, and James, this is quite interesting. It is owned by an international consortium which remains unnamed, and when asked about this, the Foundation's General Secretary, Joel Feldman, replies, the Foundation, as a matter of policy and in compliance with its obligations, does not comment on the ownership consortium. Now, this is a really interesting development. I mean, there's a bit of a mystery here. We don't know exactly who this consortium is, and the foundation that is proposing this is an authentic painting by Da Vinci. They are obligated not to talk about it. But here's what some art historians have to say, and I want to refer to an analysis from 2012 by Dr. John Asmus, who's a research physicist with the University of California at San Diego. He spoke with World Radio Switzerland in 2012, and this is what he said, and this really interested me because, like I mentioned, this is the gentleman we're referring to as the Sherlock Holmes of the art world. He said, I had published all of the Mona Lisa pictures that we had created showing what we believed was the original appearance of the Louvre Mona Lisa, and a person here in Switzerland, in Lausanne, who is representing the owner of this other Mona Lisa, asked me if I could use some of the same techniques on this other Mona Lisa that we now call the earlier Mona Lisa. And so I stopped in Lausanne and inspected the painting, took some pictures of it, and I said that the lady in the picture looks so much younger and more beautiful. I said that this is a painting that I really liked, and so they asked me if I would figure out some way of determining whether this painting was by Leonardo or not. He said, I'd been working with the Rembrandt, a research project in Amsterdam, and I'd been working with some other programs that had been analyzing paintings, and we developed some new ways of trying to associate painters with their works. And essentially what this involves is digitizing the painting and then turning it into a few billion pixels, and then looking at the statistics of those pixels. And he says, we found it in the case of the Rembrandt self-portraits and many other pictures that there's a unique statistical distribution of the pixels for a particular artist. James, this reminds me a little of the way that you're talking about the ways that we can utilize information from climate proxies from the ancient past, sediments and things like that, to calibrate radiocarbon dates and things. We've talked about this a lot. Research physicists can look at the distribution of paint on a per pixel rate from photographs of famous works of art, and they can determine the likelihood that a particular artist may have created the work. And he says he was skeptical initially when looking at this painting, which so strongly resembles the famous Mona Lisa, but after applying the same sorts of processes which have been applied to Rembrandt's, Van Gogh's, and other works of art, he said he is much of the opinion that Da Vinci actually did create this other Mona Lisa. And he was asked, do you believe in your expert opinion that this is by the hand of Leonardo da Vinci? And to that he said, and I quote, I would say that this is much more likely to be a correct attribution than in many other instances. For this painting now, with all the work that's been done by others in dating the materials and chemically analyzing the pigments to see if these are the same pigments that Leonardo used, he says you take all those data that suggest that there's nothing that can prove that this is not a Leonardo. And plus, he says our work with the geometry as well as the pixel distribution that says it's consistent with Leonardo, I would say that the case here for it being a authentic Leonardo is much stronger than many of the generally acknowledged paintings that are now hanging in museums that are actually attributed to the artist. So in the opinion of a research physicist who has really delved deeply into this, he says, there's a better case to be made that this painting was actually made by the hand of Leonardo da Vinci than many popular works of art that are attributed to him. And hence it seems in part that one of the reasons that people would be skeptical of this is, well, there's only one Mona Lisa, and if there's another, does this somehow diminish the impact, the importance, and generally what makes the famous Mona Lisa, arguably the most famous work of art in the world, so special? To me, I don't think it diminishes it in any way. It makes it all the more enigmatic, and I do have a bit of a theory, but I'm going to share that with you after I get your thoughts on this, James. What do you think's going on here?
Well, I'll address your last point there about diminishing. Does it diminish the original work of art? And I would say no. Actually, it emphasizes Leonardo's genius. He was actually able to create this work of art twice, and they're very similar. Also, on the statistical analysis, I think that's probably about as close to the truth as you could ever really come without somehow time traveling, going back and just watching the guy paint the thing. Because, you can date things and date those to the period, I suppose. But the analysis of the brush strokes and those things that you can't see with the human eye, and then compare those against those, I think that's the best way to tell between what would be real or a fake, I guess you could say, or something that was painted by somebody else. Now, just looking at the photos, obviously it does appear that the earlier painting does appear to be younger, but as you were talking, I was looking at both paintings here and comparing them side by side. And a couple of things occurred to me. One, that may be an earlier version of the same woman, as they appear very, very similar, but there's definitely some serious differences between the two paintings. One would be, one of the things that first occurred to me was, maybe the artist has developed his technique slightly over time, over a few years, or he's experimenting with different types of shading or different things. And then, we talked about this a little bit earlier, and I sort of made a joke, but the younger version sort of appears, if it was a modern photo, the one on the right would be the original photo, and the second one would be one with the Snapchat filter on it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Well, one thing I'd wondered, and again, this was exactly the same sort of sentiment that was being reflected by Dr. John Asmus. He says in the presumed second Mona Lisa, he said she looks much more young and much more beautiful. It could be that what we're looking at is an ongoing study And that actually says how little we know about the background. We believe we know who the actual model had been, and we named her. Again, there is some conjecture that Mona Lisa might have been other. I think at one point even heard someone said that Mona Lisa might be a self-portrait of Leonardo and that it actually isn't a woman at all. I think that's absurd. But that just goes to show how many different conjectures and interpretations have been raised about the painting. But my best guess, if we actually have more than one of them, and they do seem to be attributable to the hand of Leonardo, the way I would interpret that is that we're actually seeing an earlier version. We actually have a younger version of Lisa Gherardini posing for Leonardo. And we may actually have successive stages where she is posing at different times. And if there are differences in the style, it may be less his actual painting and technique, but more the accuracy of the representation of the individual, framed in that setting and painted more than once by Leonardo. And we're actually seeing her at different stages in her life, which is also fascinating.
Or consider this. Maybe he used the original photo, or not photo, but painting, as the model for the later portrait.
That's possible. But then again, if you were recreating his original work, how do we account for the differences between them? Now, again, you may be right in the sense that if these are different studies, the second one, which seems to be more detail-oriented, it may be reflective of his, an improvement of his technique. Although, again, I'm no art historian, and many would probably argue that his early work, comparable to his last work, probably shows little variance. He was a genius. He was a polymath. He was, again, not just gifted with art. That was one of many skills that he had, but really throughout his life, he was just a remarkable artist. I think that the best guess would be that in this period between the early 1500s and around 1520, maybe, thereabouts, in that 20-year period, that maybe he's done more than one portrait where Lisa is actually posing for him, and we're actually seeing her at different stages in her life. That would be my best guess. But again,
I like that theory better.
Yeah, and it's just fascinating, again, to think that there is this record in art where art history takes on a whole new meaning. What these paintings, again, if the research physicists and others who have looked at them are correct in their estimation that they're both works of art created by Leonardo, they represent stages in historical progression, and that makes the entire story even more interesting.
Yeah, I'm not much of a, I don't want to say I'm not an admirer of art, which I am, but I think sometimes the art forensics is maybe more interesting to me.
Well, it just puts another dimension to it, and I'll completely admit, in high school, I took every art class that was available, and when they no longer had art classes, then I served 2 semesters as an assistant to Chris Searcy, who had been my high school art teacher. I mean, I was just an art nut because I was painting, I was drawing, and my mom was a painter, So art history fascinates me, and that's a big part of it. When you go and you're, studying art, you're not just drawing. I mean, that's really what art is, but you do a fair amount of art history too. And at one time, I wanted to be a professional artist, and now my brother is. But I still appreciate art. I love painting. I probably should do it more myself, but when I hear a story like this, it's one of those many unique crossovers between a passion of mine from early in life and what we do here on every episode of the 7 Ages Audio Journal. Now with that, my friend, it's just about that time. I've been drinking this coffee, but my carafe is nearly dry. What do you say let's head on over here to the Crosstime Pub? And bartender, if you don't mind, I'm going to have to ask Callahan James to pour 3 glasses, one for you and I. Actually, make it 4, one for Jason and one for the new arrival. What do you say?
Oh, excellent. I think that's a fine idea.
And since Jason and the little guy aren't here, I guess you and I are going to have to do double duty. We'll take one for the team.
I'll do it when I have to, I guess.
That's right. Well, on behalf of James Waldo, our geologist in residence, Jason Pentrail, who's taking time off for daddy duty, and yours truly, Micah Hanks, we are the 7 Ages Research Associates, and we will catch you guys again next time, somewhere in time, here on the 7 Ages Audio Journal.